April 4, 1940, Ruhr Valley, Western Germany. Night settles heavy over the industrial plain. A low fog hangs above the chimneys of Essen, muting the glow of furnaces still burning for the Reich. Somewhere below, a shift whistle sounds at the Krupp steelworks, the same mills that forged tanks, guns and armor for Hitler's armies. Workers move under dim lamps, unaware that above the clouds, 1,000 engines are already roaring toward them. Over the North Sea, black shapes drift through darkness. Avro Lancasters, Halifaxes, and Sterlings, their bomb bays packed with high explosives and incendiaries. Navigation lights are extinguished. Crews speak little, the radio crackles only with course corrections, and cold breathing through oxygen masks. At 22:45, the first radar stations along the German border catch movement with a distant pulse across the screens of the Kammhuber line. Sirens wail across Essen, Dortmund, Bochum. Families rush to shelters. Anti-aircraft gunners take position, scanning the night. In the skies above, the Royal Air Force is about to strike the very heart of Nazi industry, a place once believed untouchable. When the Second World War erupted in September 1939, the Ruhr Valley stood as the industrial fortress of Germany and a dense lattice of coal mines, steel mills, and armament plants stretching from Duisburg to Dortmund. It was the engine that powered the Wehrmacht's advance across Europe, producing nearly half of Germany's steel, most of its coal, and a vast portion of its weapons and munitions. For the Allies, it was the heart of the beast. Yet in the early years of the war, that heart beat on undisturbed. The Luftwaffe ruled the skies, and Britain struggled to find its footing. In 1940, the Royal Air Force focused on survival, fighting back against the Blitz rather than striking deep into Germany. The first British bombing raids into the Reich were limited, inaccurate and symbolic at best. The Ruhr, shrouded in thick smog and defended by layers of anti-aircraft guns, seemed invincible, protected not just by steel and flak, but by geography and darkness itself. By 1941, British bomber crews flying into Germany faced overwhelming odds. Without radar guidance or long-range escorts, they navigated by moonlight, dead reckoning, and luck. Losses were high. Accuracy was abysmal. Of every 100 bombers sent to the Ruhr, many never returned, and those that did often reported missed targets by miles. The Ruhr's factories continued to produce panzer tanks, artillery, and submarine parts in staggering quantities. To Berlin, it was proof that Hitler's industrial machine could withstand anything. Behind this illusion stood an intricate web of defenses. The Germans had built what was known as the Kammhuber line, a chain of radar and searchlight zones stretching from Denmark to France. Each zone, or Himmelbett, was equipped with radar stations, anti-aircraft batteries, and night fighter control centers. It was the pride of the Luftwaffe's night defense system, capable, in theory, of intercepting any bomber formation before it reached key industrial sites. Civilians, too, placed their faith in it. Across the Ruhr, cities like Essen and Duisburg practiced air raid drills but lived in relative calm. Propaganda assured them the Reich's air defenses were impregnable. The Ruhr was the backbone of Germany, too vital, too fortified to fall. But across the Channel, a new philosophy of warfare was taking shape. Within the Royal Air Force's Bomber Command, Air Marshal Sir Arthur Harris, known to his men as Bomber Harris, believed the war could be won from the air. To him, the Ruhr was not a collection of factories. It was a single living organism whose destruction would cripple the German war effort. By late 1942, technology began to catch up with ambition. Radar navigation aids like G and Oboe, and the use of Pathfinder squadrons marking targets with flares, dramatically improved bombing accuracy at night. British bombers could now find and burn a city even through cloud and darkness. At the same time, the Americans were arriving, with a doctrine all their own. The U.S. 8th Air Force, newly based in England, rejected area bombing and insisted on daylight precision strikes. Their targets were the same: ball-bearing plants, oil refineries, and armament factories across the Ruhr. It was the beginning of what historians would later call the Battle of the Ruhr, a sustained, Allied air campaign to annihilate Germany's industrial heartland. Between March and July 1943, wave after wave of bombers would turn the night skies over western Germany into a furnace. But before that firestorm began, there was belief. Belief in the safety of the Ruhr. Belief in German engineering. belief that the Reich's iron shield would hold. It was this confidence that made what happened next so shocking. The illusion of safety was about to be tested in the most brutal way possible. By the winter of 1942, the war in Europe had entered a new and unforgiving phase. The Wehrmacht's advance in the east had stalled at Stalingrad. In North Africa, Rommel's Afrika Korps was being pushed back toward Tunisia. The tide was turning, and Britain, weary yet resolute, sought to bring the war to the German homeland itself. To Winston Churchill, the key lay in the skies. If the Reich's factories could be destroyed, the armies at the front would wither. "The fighters are our salvation," he had once said, "but the bombers alone provide the means of victory." And now, those bombers were ready. Under Air Chief Marshal Arthur Harris, Bomber Command reorganized into a weapon of strategic annihilation. No longer would single targets be pursued with surgical precision. Harris aimed for the destruction of industrial cities as a whole. His reasoning was cold but direct. Workers, housing, transport, and power grids were all part of the German war machine. To destroy one was to weaken all. In March 1943, Harris turned his gaze to the Ruhr, Germany's arsenal of victory. He envisioned not one raid, but an unrelenting campaign, a rolling thunder of night attacks designed to grind the region into ruin. It would begin with Essen, home to the Krupp Works, one of the largest armament complexes in Europe. Meanwhile, across Britain, American air bases were filling with aircraft and men. The U.S. 8th Air Force had arrived in strength, bringing the B-17 Flying Fortress and B-24 Liberator bombers built for daylight precision strikes. Where the British relied on the cover of night, the Americans trusted in altitude, formation flying, and defensive firepower. The two nations shared the same goal but fought under different suns. The British by moonlight, the Americans under blue sky. Together they formed a rhythm of destruction, day and night, ceaseless and calculated. It was a level of coordination never before seen in aerial warfare. Yet the Ruhr was no easy prey. Its defenses were among the densest in Europe. Hundreds of heavy flak batteries, searchlight zones overlapping like spiderwebs, and elite night fighter squadrons flying. Messerschmitt Bf-110 and Junkers Ju-88s. Every approach route to the valley was lined with danger. The Germans believed this wall of steel could not be breached by mere bombers. Goebbels' propaganda echoed across the airwaves. "The Ruhr is invincible. Our industry stands unbroken." For many it was comforting. For others, especially those who lived near the mills and refineries, it was hollow reassurance. In secret, British planners studied aerial photographs and radar maps, tracing the pulse of production, blast furnaces, coal trains, and power plants. They built detailed models of cities to rehearse bombing runs. They even timed the raids to strike when workers were home, maximizing disruption. Cold arithmetic ruled the plan. The operation would rely heavily on pathfinders, elite crews, flying ahead of the main force to mark targets with flares. Using new radar aids, they could illuminate cities through cloud and haze, guiding thousands of bombers behind them. When the plan was complete, it had a code name: the Battle of the Ruhr. It began on the night of March 5, 1943, with a raid on Essen. But the most devastating blow, the night when the Ruhr's confidence would shatter, came 1 month later. On April 4th, the Royal Air Force prepared for one of its most concentrated attacks of the war. The target, the industrial complex at Essen and the surrounding districts. The bomb load, nearly 2,000 tons of high explosives and incendiaries. At dusk, the first bombers began taxiing down English runways, their navigation lights glowing faintly in the mist. Crews received their final briefings, altitudes, approach routes, target markers. Each man knew the risks. Loss rates for these missions could exceed 5%, meaning 1 in 20 would not return. Still, they went. That night, the Ruhr's illusion of safety would vanish in a storm of fire and steel. The campaign had entered its most destructive phase, and for Germany's industrial heart, there would be no turning back. The human angle. In the Ruhr, life beneath the chimneys carried a rhythm of labor and unease. Essen, Dortmund, Duisburg, their names were synonymous with smoke and steel. Every day, hundreds of thousands filed into the factories that kept the German army alive. Women worked the presses once handled by men now gone to the front. Children collected shrapnel for recycling. Air raid drills punctuated daily life, but routine dulled the fear. At dusk, the glow of molten steel lit the horizon like a false sunset. To many, that light was pride, proof that the Ruhr still forged victory. To others, it was a target. They had heard of Hamburg, Cologne, Lübeck, cities that had burned under British bombs. Yet propaganda insisted the Ruhr was different. Its flak towers and radar nets made it untouchable. Families kept emergency bags ready, water, ration cards, documents, blankets. Cellars were reinforced with sandbags. And still, people slept because they had to. No one could live on fear alone. But on the night of April 4th, 1943, the sirens came too soon and too many times. Mothers hurried children underground. Old men filled buckets waiting for the fires they could already smell in memory. The earth itself began to tremble as the bombers approached, not yet seen, but felt. Above them, 348 Lancaster and Halifax bombers moved in silent procession. For the men inside, this was another mission. Their 6th, their 9th, maybe their 13th. They were young, often barely 20. In the cramped fuselage, they followed checklists by rote. Bomb doors open. Ready? Lights green. The navigator whispered bearings while the bomb aimer stared through the sight, searching for the glow of Essen. There was no joy, no hatred, only tension. Each man was part of a machine designed for destruction. When the first flares ignited below, painting the city in ghostly red, a strange calm settled over the crews. The Ruhr was awake. The tactical angle. The attack on Essen was no random act of vengeance. It was a masterwork of coordination, precision, and adaptation. For years, Bomber Command had struggled against German night defenses. Now it had learned how to overwhelm them. At 21 hours, Pathfinder Force, led by Group Captain Don Bennett, took off ahead of the main bomber stream. Their task, to locate the target and drop marker flares with the help of radar systems, H2S and oboe, the most advanced navigational aids of the war. The Germans had boasted that clouds and blackout would blind the British. Bennett's men intended to prove otherwise. The plan exploited a weakness in the Kammhuber line. Each German night fighter control zone could only track and intercept a limited number of bombers at once. By sending hundreds through a narrow corridor simultaneously, Bomber Command saturated the defense system. Controllers could only shout into the void as radar screens overflowed with contacts. When the main force crossed into Germany, flak batteries erupted across the frontier. Searchlights crisscrossed the sky, forming white cones that hunted the invisible intruders. But there were too many. The British stream moved as one, a river of aircraft 20 miles long, each maintaining radio silence and a strict flight path. At 22:47, the first Pathfinders reached Essen. They released bright red and green target markers directly over the city center. Below, the Krupp works loomed in shadow. Within minutes, the first wave of Lancasters released their bombs. High explosives shattered roofs and roads. Moments later came the incendiaries, magnesium and phosphorus canisters that burst into cascades of white fire. The tactical pattern was deliberate. Heavy bombs first to open the city, then incendiaries to feed on oxygen and debris. German flak crews fought desperately. Dozens of guns fired blindly into the night, their muzzles flashing like frantic signals. Night fighters scrambled from bases at Düsseldorf and Münster. But confusion reigned. Radio frequencies jammed. Radar screens glitched from chaff and jamming interference. The defense network was drowning. The raid lasted just over an hour. To the RAF, it was a textbook execution of combined technology and planning. To the people below, it was the apocalypse. When dawn came, the Ruhr would see its own reflection in smoke. The technological angle. By 1943, the air war over Europe had become a battle of innovation, a contest of electronics, metallurgy, and mathematics as much as of courage. The Ruhr raids represented the sharp edge of that evolution. The British Avro Lancaster, centerpiece of Bomber Command, was the result of years of painful trial and error. 4 Rolls-Royce Merlin engines gave it both altitude and endurance, allowing it to carry over 6 tons of bombs, far more than any aircraft before it. Its cavernous bomb bay could hold not just standard explosives, but massive cookies and 4,000-pound blockbusters designed to tear open roofs and water mains so that incendiaries could do their work. Each crew relied on a growing array of instruments. H2S radar, a dish-shaped scanner mounted under the fuselage, projected the outlines of cities onto a small cathode screen. Even through clouds or darkness, navigators could identify rivers, coastlines, and factory clusters by their radar shadows. Alongside it, the oboe system, ground-based transmitters, calculating distance and bearing, allowed pathfinders to mark targets with astonishing accuracy. Against this, the Germans countered with their own technology. Radar-guided flak, the Liechtenstein radar system for night fighters, and a network of listening posts feeding data into the Kammhuber line. But the British had learned to jam, deceive, and overwhelm. Window. Thin strips of aluminum foil scattered from bombers created clouds of false echoes on radar screens. Operators saw hundreds of ghost aircraft where there were none. It was a silent duel. Electronics against electronics, a war fought on frequencies and in phosphor glows. And as the bomb bays opened over Essen, it became clear that the British were beginning to dominate that invisible battlefield. The leadership angle. At the center of it all stood Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Harris, the architect of Britain's strategic bombing campaign. His belief was absolute, that air power could break the enemy's capacity to fight, both materially and morally. He once said, "They sowed the wind, and now they are going to reap the whirlwind." Harris was a controversial figure, stubborn, calculating, yet utterly devoted to his air crews. He had watched Britain endure the Blitz and saw in bombing not vengeance, but justice, the means to end a war that consumed millions. To him, the Ruhr was not merely a cluster of factories. It was the source of the weapons that rained upon London, Coventry, and Plymouth. Inside his operations room at High Wycombe, maps of Germany were marked with colored pins. Red for completed raids, blue for planned ones. Essen, Dortmund, Duisburg. The same names appeared again and again. Harris understood that victory required persistence. The Ruhr, he told his staff, is the heart of German resistance. We must cut the arteries that feed it. To some within the Allied command, his methods bordered on ruthlessness. The Americans preferred daylight precision strikes aimed specifically at industrial plants. Harris rejected the idea of restraint. His goal was paralysis, to collapse the enemy's entire industrial and psychological framework. In the spring of 1943, that doctrine was being tested like never before. The enemy angle. Inside Germany, the defenders faced a grim awakening. The Ruhr's protection depended on the Luftwaffe's night fighter arm, led by General Josef Kammhuber. His carefully designed defense system, a grid of radar sectors and coordinated searchlights, had once seemed impregnable. But now, under the relentless pressure of Allied saturation tactics, it was unraveling. Flak crews stationed around Essen worked in suffocating heat and deafening noise. Each 80mm gun fired shells that exploded thousands of feet above, black bursts illuminated by tracer arcs. Crews shouted corrections through smoke and chaos. They rarely saw their targets. They aimed at sound and flame. For the night fighter pilots, it was worse. They scrambled into the darkness with almost no visibility, guided only by radio vectors and the eerie blips of radar screens. The sky was filled with confusion, friendly and enemy planes crossing paths, tracer lines streaking randomly. Many never returned. Among civilians and soldiers alike, a painful truth began to spread. The Ruhr was not safe. The once vaunted Kammhuber line could no longer stem the tide. The bombers came in hundreds, in thousands, day after day, night after night. The defenders still fought, but now they were fighting against inevitability. And as April 4th turned to dawn, the war in the air reached a point of no return. April 4th, 1943, 22:30 hours. The night over western Germany was cloudless and still. Far above the sleeping towns, a low hum began to build, faint at first like distant thunder, then deepening into a steady, living roar. The sound came from hundreds of engines moving in perfect rhythm. At 18,000 feet, the leading Pathfinder Lancasters crossed the Rhine. From their altitude, the Ruhr was a shadow, only the faint reflection of the moon on the river and the glow of factory fires marked its outline. Below, the flak towers of Essen waited. Searchlights swept lazily at first, then froze as radar stations along the frontier reported the oncoming storm. In the Krupp complex, workers paused at the clang of air raid sirens. Some stayed by their machines, refusing to leave until supervisors shouted for evacuation. Others fled toward cellars and tunnels. The first heavy guns began firing from the outskirts, long arcs of tracer reaching into the sky like desperate fingers. At 22:45, the first red target markers ignited over Essen. They burned like bloody stars, slowly drifting down toward the heart of the city. A minute later, green flares joined them, the confirmation signal for the main force. Then the heavens opened. The first wave of Lancasters and Halifaxes began their bombing runs with machine precision. Bomb doors opened in unison. Bombs away echoed across intercoms. One by one, 4,000-pound cookies fell, followed by clusters of incendiaries that scattered like glowing seeds. The explosions came in rolling waves, deep, concussive impacts that tore at the ground and shattered the night air. From above, crews could see entire districts vanish beneath the blossoms of fire. Streets were swallowed. Roofs peeled away like paper. Even through the cockpit glass, the heat shimmered. The Krupp foundry complex was hit directly. Molten metal spilled from ruptured furnaces, streaming across the ground like rivers of flame. German anti-aircraft batteries responded with ferocity. Shells burst around the bombers, black clouds studded with orange fire. The sky became a lattice of smoke and light. One Lancaster took a direct hit and disintegrated instantly, its fragments spiraling into the inferno below. Another limped westward, its right wing aflame. Still, the stream pressed on. In the command center beneath Essen, Luftwaffe controllers shouted coordinates into overloaded radios. The radar scopes were filled with static. British window had blinded their instruments. Night fighters scrambled in vain, lost among false echoes and interference. A Ju-88 pilot described the chaos later. There were so many contacts. It was like chasing ghosts. We fired at shadows. At 23:10, the second wave arrived. By now, the entire city center was burning. The glow was visible more than 50 miles away. The target markers, obscured by fire, were replaced with new flares dropped directly into the sea of flames. Even with the smoke reaching 10,000 feet, navigators could aim by the light alone. Inside a basement shelter on Huffelandstrasse, dozens huddled in silence. The air was thick with dust. Each explosion shook the walls and extinguished candles. Some prayed. Others stared blankly, numb from the unending thunder. When the incendiaries began to fall nearby, oxygen vanished. Paint ignited, bricks glowed. Survivors later recalled the roar of the fires, like a storm trapped under the ground. Above, the bombers continued their deadly procession, one formation after another. The air stank of cordite and oil. Radio transmissions between aircraft were calm, almost detached. Target well hit. Visibility excellent. Course 275 on return. By midnight, the attack began to thin. The last waves released their payloads into what had become a single, unbroken firestorm. Flak guns still fired, but most of the city's power had failed. Communications were collapsing. The Ruhr's strongest fortress was burning uncontrollably, its defenses overwhelmed by sheer magnitude. At Iro 30, the final British bomber cleared the target area. Below, Essen glowed like a forge, the air above it pulsing with heat. Crews could still see the fires even as they crossed the Rhine on their way home. Behind them, the once proud heart of German industry was disintegrating. The ground crews at High Wycombe would later mark the operation as one of Bomber Command's most successful. Nearly perfect concentration, devastating accuracy. But for those still trapped beneath the smoke, the night had only begun. When dawn rose over the Ruhr on April 5, 1943, it revealed a landscape that seemed torn from another world. A gray haze hung low over Essen, thick with the smell of burned metal and oil. Smoke drifted for miles, rolling slowly over the Rhine like fog from a dying fire. Where the Krupp works had stood, there was ruin. Entire assembly halls were flattened, cranes toppled, blast furnaces cracked open, and rail lines twisted like melted wire. Bomb craters swallowed whole streets. The power station was a scorched skeleton. Thousands of workers arriving at dawn stood silent before the wreckage, unable to comprehend the scale of what they saw. The city itself was unrecognizable. Neighborhoods once alive with families were now heaps of smoking rubble. Windows had vanished. Roofs were gone. In the central districts, the fires burned unchecked for nearly 48 hours. Feeding on timber, oil, and human debris, rescue workers clawed through the ruins with bare hands, listening for muffled cries. They rarely found anyone alive. For the German command, the psychological impact was immediate and profound. The Ruhr, the fortress of production, the symbol of the Reich's industrial invincibility, had been penetrated and gutted in a single night. Reports from Essen described total communication breakdown. Telephone lines were down, water mains destroyed, and even the flak batteries had suffered casualties from collapsing emplacements. Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels received the first situation brief before dawn. His diary that morning contained a single line: "The blow against the Ruhr is heavier than any we have endured before." The official news bulletins, however, spoke only of minor damage and enemy exaggeration. But no one in the Ruhr believed that anymore. The British crews returning to England were greeted with quiet efficiency, not celebration. By 05 most had landed. Mechanics counted the survivors of 348 aircraft sent. 21 were missing. It was a costly but acceptable loss. In the debriefing rooms, navigators spread out target photos taken from automatic cameras. The images showed the truth more starkly than any words could. A city obliterated. For the men who had flown, the feelings were complex. Relief came first, the joy of survival. Then silence. Many avoided looking at the photographs. Some stared unblinking at the flickering light of the projectors. They had done their duty, yet knew what their bombs had done to human lives. In Berlin, Hitler's inner circle convened to assess the damage. Armaments Minister Albert Speer was dispatched to the Ruhr to survey the ruins. What he found shook him. Krupp's production lines, which had once produced over a third of Germany's heavy artillery, were halted. The surrounding transportation network, bridges, railways, canals, was paralyzed. Coal shipments dropped by nearly 40% in a single week. Speer later wrote, "We had always assumed that the Ruhr could not fall. That night proved we were wrong." The Luftwaffe, humiliated, scrambled to strengthen its defenses. New radar units were ordered. Night fighter wings were redeployed. But none of it could erase the truth that the enemy had found the limits of German resistance. The Kammhuber line, once a marvel of coordination, was now regarded as inadequate against mass saturation tactics. For the civilians of Essen, survival became endurance. Thousands were homeless. Tens of thousands were displaced. Makeshift soup kitchens were set up in cellars and parks. The city's water ran black with soot for days. Yet amid the devastation, the spirit of the population, hardened by years of propaganda and pride, refused to fully collapse. They cleared rubble by hand, rebuilt shelters, and returned to what factories could still function. But deep down they knew the illusion had ended. If the Ruhr could burn, no city in Germany was safe. That knowledge spread quickly, carried by refugees, letters, and whispers. In the pubs of Berlin, people spoke quietly of the fire from the west. In Britain, newspapers hailed the raid as a triumph of organization and technology. The heart of the Reich hammered, one headline read. To the Allied command, the message was clear. The strategy was working. Each raid weakened the German war machine more than any ground battle could. To the men and women who had lived through the night in Essen, however, it was the beginning of a new kind of terror, one that would return again and again, with fire, light, and thunder. The Battle of the Ruhr had truly begun. The morning after the Essen raid, the industrial pulse of the Ruhr slowed to a stuttering rhythm. Smoke continued to rise from the valley for days, blotting out the sun. Across the region, production lines stood silent. The air smelled of burned oil and iron dust. The scent of industry turned to ruin. Inspection teams from Berlin arrived within 48 hours. They moved through the ruins in stunned silence. Entire factories were missing, replaced by pits filled with twisted girders. The Krupp works, once the pride of German engineering, was reduced to heaps of slag and molten steel. It was said that not a single window remained unbroken within 10 kilometers of the main blast zone. Albert Speer's assessment was grim. In his report to Hitler, he admitted that the Ruhr's armament production had been crippled temporarily, possibly decisively. He noted that repair efforts could take months, if not longer. Raw materials could no longer move easily. The bombing had severed rail junctions, destroyed bridges, and buried canal routes under rubble. The numbers told their own story. Essen's output of heavy artillery dropped by nearly half in April. Ammunition deliveries to the Eastern Front slowed. Coal shipments from the mines near Bochum and Gelsenkirchen were disrupted for weeks. Even power generation faltered, leaving factories dark. But beyond the numbers, something deeper had fractured. The myth of the Ruhr's invulnerability. For years, the Nazi regime had proclaimed that Germany's industrial heart was shielded by impregnable flak and the efficiency of the Luftwaffe. Now, even loyal civilians whispered doubts. In an internal memorandum, Goebbels wrote bitterly, "The population no longer believes our assurances. They know now that the enemy can strike anywhere." Yet the regime could not afford defeatism. Orders came swiftly from Berlin. Repairs were to begin immediately, no matter the cost. Thousands of laborers, prisoners, and foreign workers were mobilized to clear debris. Temporary facilities were built among the ruins. Even as bodies were still being pulled from the rubble, production resumed, a testament to both German resilience and desperation. In the shelters beneath Essen, survivors struggled to return to a semblance of life. Families cooked on open fires amid shattered streets. Schools were converted into makeshift hospitals. Entire blocks were cordoned off as uninhabitable zones. Still, workers returned to what factories remained intact, motivated by ration cards and propaganda that spoke of duty to the fatherland. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe worked feverishly to adapt. The defense of the Ruhr became its highest priority. Flak batteries were reinforced, radar networks recalibrated, and new night fighter groups were established under veteran aces. The effort drained resources from the front lines, forcing commanders to divert aircraft from Russia and the Mediterranean just to defend German skies. But the British had learned a critical truth. No fortress could withstand a storm that never ceased. Within 2 weeks of the Essen raid, Bomber Command struck Dortmund, then Duisburg, then Bochum. The raids merged into one continuous campaign, a nightly rhythm of engines, explosions and flame. To the Allied planners, the success of the Ruhr attacks confirmed the effectiveness of mass bombing. Arthur Harris reported to London that the campaign was achieving strategic paralysis. Churchill, reading the dispatch, underlined a single sentence: "The Ruhr burns," and with it, the enemy's strength. For the people of Germany, it was the beginning of a long descent. Each night carried the possibility of annihilation. Each dawn revealed new ruins. The fire that had consumed Essen would soon spread across the entire industrial belt. And with it, the hope that the Reich could ever rebuild its shattered shield. The destruction of Essen did not end with smoke and silence. It reshaped the war itself. For the first time, Allied command understood that strategic bombing could alter not just cities, but the entire rhythm of an enemy nation. Within weeks of the April 1943 raid, the Allied air strategy entered a new phase of confidence. The Battle of the Ruhr expanded relentlessly. Between March and July, over 43,000 tons of bombs would fall upon the industrial corridor. Each raid was larger, more coordinated, and increasingly precise. The British by night, the Americans by day. Together they formed a continuous cycle of pressure that Germany's defenses could not sustain. Factories that survived one attack were often destroyed in the next. Repair crews worked under constant threat. Rail yards rebuilt by day were bombed again by night. The Luftwaffe's night fighter command, stretched thin, began to crumble under the strain. Fuel shortages worsened. Pilot losses mounted. Albert Speer, overseeing Germany's armaments, recognized the futility. In his later memoirs, he admitted, "We were compelled to scatter our industry. The concentration of power that once gave us strength became our greatest weakness." This decentralization marked a fatal turning point. Forced to move production out of the Ruhr, Germany relocated factories into forests, tunnels, and small towns across the Reich. It was an immense logistical burden, moving machinery, workers, and materials under constant bombardment. Transportation lines buckled. Efficiency collapsed. What had once been a unified industrial machine now fractured into hundreds of vulnerable fragments. At the same time, Allied air power was evolving. The RAF continued to refine its night tactics, improving radar jamming, perfecting Pathfinder techniques, and introducing even heavier ordnance. Across the Channel, the U.S. 8th Air Force increased its daylight raids, hitting synthetic fuel plants and aircraft factories with deadly precision. The cooperation between the two air arms created what historians would later call the 24-hour bombing clock. When the British returned from their night missions, American crews were already fueling their fortresses for daylight assaults. There was no rest for the Reich. German morale began to fracture under the weight of ceaseless alarm sirens. Diaries from Essen-Dortmund and Dusseldorf tell of sleepless nights, of mothers sewing blackout curtains that no longer mattered, of children learning to recognize the deep rumble of a Lancaster long before seeing its silhouette. By the summer of 1943, the once proud workers of the Ruhr spoke less of victory and more of endurance. "We no longer ask when the bombers will come," one foreman wrote. "Only how long we can live beneath them." For the Allies, success came at a terrible cost. Bomber Command lost thousands of men over the Ruhr campaign. Each mission exacted its toll. Burning aircraft, missing crews, and long columns of smoke marking their path home. But in the calculation of total war, those sacrifices were seen as necessary. The British Air Staff concluded that the campaign had achieved irreversible disruption. Year's end. The Ruhr's steel production had fallen by over 80% in some areas. The region's electrical grid, once the strongest in Europe, was crippled beyond repair. The German leadership tried to mask the disaster, but the truth seeped through every broken window, every ration line. The Ruhr, the symbol of the Reich's might, was now its greatest vulnerability. And as the Allies prepared for even greater offensives, the bombing of Hamburg, the destruction of Berlin, and eventually the assault on Normandy, the lessons of Essen, would guide every mission. The night the Ruhr burned had proven what air power could do. It had also revealed what it would cost humanity to wield it. The night the Ruhr burned was more than a single raid. It was a revelation, a glimpse into the power and peril of industrialized warfare. For centuries, cities had been protected by walls, armies, and geography. But in 1943, fire and steel rained from the sky, indiscriminate and unyielding, and even the mightiest industrial fortress could not stand. Strategically, the destruction of Essen and the Ruhr reshaped the course of World War. Germany was forced to scatter its factories, disrupting production and logistics. The Allied bombing campaign, once experimental and uncertain, had become a weapon capable of striking at the very heart of a nation. The lesson was stark. In modern war, control of the skies could determine the survival of armies, economies, and entire cities. Technologically, the raid exemplified the cutting edge of human ingenuity. Radar, navigation aids, pathfinder tactics, and mass formation flying converged to create a precision never before possible. Yet innovation carried a dual weight. Each device, each method, was designed not for creation, but for destruction, a testament to how human skill can serve both genius and devastation. And for the people who lived through it, the cost was measured not in strategy or statistics, but in lives disrupted, homes destroyed, and the psychological shadow that lingered long after the fires faded. Thousands had died, tens of thousands more were displaced, and an entire way of life in the Ruhr was shattered. Yet amid the ruins, resilience endured, a stubborn insistence to live, rebuild, and remember. Looking back, that night stands as both a warning and a turning point. It shows the immense power of strategy, technology, and leadership, and the profound consequences of wielding them. The Ruhr, once thought untouchable, became a symbol of vulnerability, a reminder that no fortress, however mighty, can escape the sweep of history when the instruments of war are unleashed. In the silence that followed the flames, the world glimpsed a new reality. Modern warfare was not only fought on battlefields, but across skies over cities, and deep within the fabric of human civilization itself.